So it's my great pleasure to chair this first panel, and I want to say we're really delighted to have such a high quality of presenters this morning to kick off this conference on women in the war of 1812. Rather than introduce them all at once, I'm going to introduce them before they speak, because if you're like me, you start to mix up who's who, and so we'll start with Dr. Jane Errington, because I'm just going to go in the order of the program. And so many of you will be familiar with Jane. She just recently retired as Dean of the Royal Arts at the Royal Military College, but is still very actively involved in graduate teaching at Queen's University. She is the author of several books and articles, probably the ones that, for those of us in women's history who know the best, would be Wives and Mothers, Schoolmistresses, and Scullery Maids, which appeared in 1995, and her Immigrant Worlds and Transatlantic Communities work as well. In addition to her leadership role in terms of administration, I noticed that she won several awards, and I'm not going to list them all, but in research excellence. So I think that speaks very highly of her scholarly achievements. And a leadership award. So she's going to be our new chair, you see. So when we looked around, we said, where's the person who can really lead us into the future? And that will be Jane. And her new work, as I understand it, is on imperial masculinity and the making of RFC. So Jane.
Okay. So now I get to do my stick. First, I would like to thank you. I'd like to particularly thank Alison and Gail, who, together with the rest of the executive, were instrumental in bringing all of this together. Really have done a wonderful job. We did almost all of it by email, but they were the ones who kept prompting the rest of us instead of saying, so, what do you think? Well, what do you think? We have to make a decision now. And every so often you could hear, as I sat in Kingston, the frustration as they went, for God's sakes, Jane, just answer. So I am delighted to kick off today's gig, and the title of my paper is Living on the Precipice. And it's Living on the Precipice. The whole panel is dealing with sort of situations largely before the war. And I think what we're trying to do is sort of give you a setup of what the world was like in those years before June 18th, 1812, when war was officially declared. And in early June of 1812, news began to trickle into Upper Canada that the United States and Great Britain, which would have meant Upper Canada, would soon be at war. Now, readers of the two local newspapers, there was one here in York, the York Gazette, and another in Kingston, the Kingston Gazette, were not particularly surprised, but they were still hopeful that what they would have considered a, quote, unnatural war might yet be averted. After all, Upper Canadians had experienced such scares before, in 1794, in 1807, in 1811, and in January of 1812. Each time, colonial leaders, except for the last, colonial leaders who predicted that, quote, war was at no great distance, and each time the U.S. government, at least if you read the story from north of the border, had realized the futility of conflict and negotiators had worked out a settlement. Then, on June 23rd, 1812, Stephen Miles, in Kingston, the editor of the Kingston Gazette, publicly announced, quoting a report from the Boston Gazette, that President Madison had officially signed the declaration of war. Clearly, war with the United States was no longer to be avoided, even though, as the editor of the York Gazette said a week later, everyone knew, including most Americans, that the conflict was, quote, totally unnecessary, inexpedient, and impolitic. Now, such sentiments did not change the situation, however. Indeed, after years of living on the precipice, Upper Canadians and their closest neighbors living just south of the border found themselves, officially at least, enemies. What had, for the last 25 years or so, been a relatively harmonious relationship had been transformed by the stroke of a pen into a broken, bewildering, and often heart-wrenching state of war. Colonists were dismayed. So today I want to talk briefly about what is that situation before the war, and how women and men and children sort of both responded, and why they responded the way they did. One might assume that certainly some would have been quite eager to right the wrongs of the American Revolution. And what is interesting is that we get no sense of that at all in this period. For most, there was dismay and distress at the prospect of war. This is a story about colonists who were officially loyal to the king and country and proud members of the British Empire, were also North American settlers, whose lives were rooted in the land and sensibilities of the New World. And the nature of the people, their own histories, and their particular circumstances living on a borderland were instrumental in shaping their response to the war. So a little bit of background. Upper Canada, as many of you know, was one of the, quote, loyal provinces created after the Revolution. There were two, Upper Canada and New Brunswick. And it was created in 1791, and it was created in part in recognition for the, quote, trials and tribulations that the Loyalists, who were refugees, had experienced during the Revolution. And those Loyalists in Upper Canada were looking at between 5 and 6, I mean, we have a real problem with numbers, between 5 and 6,000 of them. Women, men, and children had been given land on the North Shore of the St. Lawrence and the Lower Great Lakes. And had, after some agitation, we had this creation of this, quote, loyal colony. And they began to sort of eke out a living in what they called the Howling Wilderness. Now, what's interesting is that in 1812, the population we estimate is about 75,000. And what we know is that the Loyalists, who in fact were quite productive and produced lots of children, they did not produce that many children. And what we know is that certainly most of them are not Loyalists, because starting in the mid-1790s, a new group of migrants began to arrive in the colony, clearly not refugees of the Revolution, but what they were was enterprising American settlers coming north in search of opportunities for themselves and their children. They're often referred to as late Loyalists, but they cared little about whether they were living in a British colony or the new republic. It didn't really matter. They were looking for land, and they were much more interested in the availability of land and the promise of no taxes. That sounds interesting. What we know is that by 1810, their numbers had swelled to the point that one traveler noted that the Loyalist element was scarcely noticeable amongst the diversity of people who made up Upper Canada. What we've got is a colony of very diverse American settlers in 1812. And though it was a, quote, loyal province, it was a province or colony, it was a province where people, in fact, had come from, as one traveler said, many different states and nations. They spoke a variety of languages, even though the official language was English. They adhered to a widely differing religious traditions and beliefs. In short, Upper Canada is a land of immigrants in 1812. It's a land of immigrants where we actually don't have a host community, right? So you want to imagine a world where what we've got in 25 years is, you know, probably 50,000, 60,000 people arriving, all from all over the place. Most of them coming from south of the border, not all of them, but most of them from south of the border. But there's very little sense of common identity, even though at the top there is a sense that, yes, we're British. But that doesn't mean a whole lot when you're trying to actually make your living and carry on and just survive. Now, what this heterogeneous population, I think, did share was, in fact, coping with the world that they were now in. Most residents in Upper Canada lived on the land, and their lives were dictated by the rhythms of seasons, the backbreaking work of clearing and planting and harvesting, and the endless jobs involved in clothing, feeding, and caring for their families. When the Loyalists first arrived, one resident did talk about, he remembered in 1810, that this was a, quote, howling wilderness, less known and less cultivated. In those first few years, and in fact again and again and again, life was very difficult. Amelia Harris recounted how her mother, when she first arrived in Long Point with her infant son in the late 1780s, she first stayed with a German family, quote, living in a miserable log hut. Although the family had funds, and in fact had considerable funds relative to everybody else, their first home was an Indian shanty-style log cabin. And it was some time before the Ryers could move into what Margaret's mother called her new palace, which was a 4-room log house. By that time, the family had 4 close neighbors, the closest being 3 miles away by land, by water, 6 miles away by land. So that it gives you sort of some sense of what this colony initially is like. What we know is that within a few years, the first arrivals begin to be more settled, their fortunes are more secure, and as a resident judge, they soon began to boast of, quote, fruitful fields and comfortable homes. And by 1812, I don't think there's any question that the sort of rocks and trees that had greeted Elizabeth Simcoe when she and her husband made their way up the St. Lawrence in 1792 had periodically begun to give way to sort of recognizable farms. There were still large swaths of country where there appeared to be no habitation. And the pioneering cycle, I want you to remember, gets reenacted again and again and again. As people arrive, they move to the bush, and they do what Amelia Harris's mother was doing, which in fact is they themselves have got to clear land, they've got to harvest, they've got to do this. So that we've got this sort of, at the same time we've got a continuing pioneering cycle. We actually begin to have by 1812 some settlements. Not everybody is going on the land. We've got by then 3 quite substantial, in relative terms, communities. We've got Kingston, York, and Niagara. But it is a colony which is in very much sort of in the making. It's not been made yet in this. And people are just concerned about coping in this world. Now, of those 3 communities, initially those 3 communities are built, or the 2 first, are built in the shadows of the British garrison. When Anne Kirby Macaulay arrived as a new bride in 1791, Kingston had about 50 wooden homes, it was, she said, and a few merchant sheds. A few years later, Niagara, which for a very short time was the capital of the colony, boasted a courthouse, a jail, legislative buildings, and its own newspaper. It also had, as Elizabeth Russell, who was the sister of the administrator, reported, some excellent dwellings in the upper end of town. Now, within a decade, however, York is certainly beginning to eclipse Niagara because York had begun to grow like topsy out of the bush. And it's interesting because we look at them now, and they're tiny villages. I don't know how many of you live in tiny villages, but I live near Inverary, which has about the same number of houses as Kingston had in 1791. But these are substantial communities in relative terms in Upper Canada. There they offered residents, the few residents, economic and social amenities unavailable to most colonists. Women could supplement their homegrown food by going to the weekly market. On Sundays they could go to the local Anglican church or meet with like-minded neighbors at the Methodist meeting house or the Baptist meeting house. If they had their means, they could send their children perhaps to a dame school, and they could shop in the growing number of stores and artisans communities. They also had neighbors relatively close by to help in emergencies and childbirth and all sorts of other activities that they would work in. Life in the colonial villages reflected the growing economic and social complexity of life in this young colony. And as one colonist concluded, and I read this again 2 nights ago when I was putting this together, and he ends he's got this sort of laudatory, writing in 1810, this laudatory, how much we've done since 1780s, and he says, he talks about the remarkable changes to the colonies that the benevolent mind must dwell upon with peculiar complacency. Now, I'm actually not sure that most of the residents would have been complacent about the accomplishments. They still lived in similar circumstances to those of their cousins and friends and nephews and whatever south of the border, and their lives are fully occupied just making sure the needs of their families are met. So that's sort of part of the general background. Now, when we get to the specific background, there are very particular circumstances in Upper Canada which are also going to help dictate how they respond to the war. This is a colony where travel between one part of the colony and another is almost impossible for much of this period. It's certainly difficult, even in the summer. You don't know what the winds are going to be like. The easiest way to get out of the colony is to go south. The easiest way to get into the colony is to go south. The United States, this new republic, were their closest, Upper Canadians' closest and most accessible neighbors. As you know, the settlers came north, so did visitors, mail, newspapers, all sorts of things came north. Upper Canada was part of a borderland community in the years before the war, and these are ties which are very quickly renewed after the Revolution. One traveler talked about how he was actually very surprised in the 1790s how mutual passions had mutually subsided, he said, on either side of the border, and the most social harmony prevailed between gentlemen on the British and American side. And it was not just the gentlemen. We know that Jane Stewart, the wife of the minister, the Reverend in Kingston, had regular correspondence with associates south of the border, and she went to visit friends in upstate New York, not regularly, but as often as she could. Anne Macaulay of Kingston regularly visited her family in upstate New York, and Elizabeth Russell, we know, contemplated, quote, taking the waters in the Republic, because she was not a terribly well woman. Now, what we get then are very, very strong and renewed personal links, north and south. At the same time, we get merchants, traders, farmers beginning to engage in lucrative economic relations with associates from south of the border. We actually get Anne Macaulay, for example, purchasing seeds and trees, orchard trees in the market that she brought from the United States. Once newspapers began to appear in the colony, local editors relied on reports from the United States, or, quote, what they called the latest news from New York, or received from our most recent dispatch from the United States, to fill their pages and keep their readers informed. In short, the Republic to the south was Upper Canada's primary window on the world, and being a resident of this British colony did not in any way mean that they were also not part of an American community, and an American community which I think most people took for granted in this early period. So when war comes, or at least is threatened, this is not just any war to be fought in some far-off part of the land. I mean, they've been reading about Napoleon, they knew what was going on.